So obviously there are no rules that tell you what objectives you must have in which perspective. In fact, if you think of comparing McDonald's against Burger King, in 50,000 feet, they should both look identical. Yet when you get down to the detail, the small changes in strategic objectives and weightings have created billions of dollars of valuation between the two. But here's a checklist of general categories of the sorts of perspective objectives we see by perspective. Financial perspective. Typically, you're trying to drive shareholder value, and your activities there fit into three broad categories. Your strategy is either going to focus on financial productivity, how can we reduce your cost structure? Revenue growth, how do you drive the revenue numbers, build a franchise, increase customer value, or optimize use of assets. In the example we've been using of Southwest Airlines or WestJet, the idea of minimizing turnaround time on those airplanes is really about optimizing use of assets. The more that they can keep that airplane in the air, the more revenue they generate. On the customer, it's all about what do customers value, and customers will basically do business with you for three broad categories. Either your product attributes, things like the functionality of your product, the quality, the timeliness, the breadth of offerings that you have, and of course the price or services that go along with it. Or the image. So my children like to wear Nike t-shirts, but they probably don't perform significantly different than what you could get from Mark's Work Warehouse. Knowledgeable staff, professional management, those sorts of things. Or finally, about the relationship you have with that organization, which is about the availability, the experience, the convenience, responsiveness, the flexibility, and the values that that company has against yours. So again, categories of objectives we typically see in the customer perspective. On the internal perspective, we typically have 3 and maybe 4 objectives. In most of our clients, at least to begin with, we expect them to have something around product leadership or innovation. So things about what you're doing to move your product ahead. Operational excellence, things you're doing to make your processes perform better. Customer intimacy, things you have to build a relationship with your customers. Those 3 we expect to have objectives on almost every strategy map we see to begin with. Now, some organizations focus on one thing or the other. So in the pizza world, you might think of people like Pizza or Domino's who try to get their pizza to you in 30 minutes or it's free. That's an operational excellence strategy. Pizza Hut typically has more of a product leadership approach in that market where they're constantly promoting new pizza types that they have available. And customer intimacy is better represented by the small pizza shop that you might go to, where the menu's been the same since you graduated from high school. They just keep using white-off to change the prices. And of course, they haven't changed the products. So the same market space, 3 completely different strategies and very successful companies. And then finally, typically in the internal perspective, there may be objectives that talk about regulatory compliance, whether that's health and safety, environment, risk, those sorts of things. Then the enablers, or learning and growth perspective. In there, we typically look for things like the strategic competencies that you need, the culture or climate for action, and finally the strategic technologies. Strategic technologies are those things which, if your company burnt down tomorrow, could you not replace? So you could probably replace the building or the trucks or the computers, but maybe not the customer relationships or the human capital or the order fulfillment database and so forth. So those things fit into the strategic technologies category. Now, again, it's important to note this is not a checklist of everything that should and needs to be there, but rather some reminders of things you might want to consider. The net is it's a complicated relationship between these strategic objectives. And on a strategy map, we're going to cover those things off. So, for example, if you remember, we talked about either financial productivity or revenue growth. And these are typical objectives. On productivity, it's cost structure, asset utilization. Revenue strategy, it's about customer value and so forth. So a strategy map may describe one or more of these objectives and how they interrelate to create success for the organization. And although these categories are described to you within the 4 perspectives of the balanced scorecard, these are strategic generalities that I would expect to see if you used any other framework in your organization. Another way of showing them is if I were to put each one of those core strategic objectives on a single map, it would look a bit like this. Now, it's probably a bit confusing, and some of these you could probably drop because they weren't important to your organization. But the net is, this is kind of sort of what a strategy map would look like based on that template.